Sterling Maddox knew his quiet housemaid was a thief. To prove it, he set a trap with his mother's priceless locket. When it disappeared, he followed her, ready to deliver his cold justice. But the truth he discovered in a crumbling shack would not just shame him. It would unravel his very soul. The Maddox Ranch was a kingdom of dust and order sprawling across the Texas plains under a sky that rarely promised rain. Peace in this part of the world had always been as fragile as morning frost, and Sterling Maddox preferred the certainty of fences to the ambiguity of men. He ruled his domain not with a loud voice or a quick hand, but with a ledger book bound in scarred leather and a cold, unwavering gaze. His world was one of numbers of cattle counted, and wages paid of profits and losses tallied in a neat, unforgiving script. It was a fortress of silence he had built around himself, stone by stone, since his father's passing. In this silent, measured world, Cora Whitmore existed. She was a housemaid as quiet and unobtrusive as a shadow on the wall, her presence marked only by the gleam of a polished floor or the scent of lye soap. She was frail, with a bone-deep weariness in her eyes that seemed older than her years, and a persistent dry cough she tried to stifle in the folds of her apron. The sound was a small, unwelcome crack in the sterile perfection of Sterling's home. Yet her work was flawless. Every surface shone, every meal was punctual, every stitch in his mended shirts was impossibly neat. She moved through the grand, empty house with a ghost's grace, never meeting his eye, her silence a mirror of his own. For months this quiet arrangement held. He provided a roof and a wage. She provided an orderly existence. It was a transaction clean and simple, the only kind of relationship Sterling still understood. But then the first discrepancy appeared. A tin of preserved peaches, one he had been saving, vanished from the larder. He noted it in his mind, a minor irritation, a stone in the otherwise smooth path of his daily life. He said nothing. An accusation was an emotional expenditure, a messy affair of denials and tears, and he had no appetite for it. A week later, a small sack of pinto beans was gone. Again he noted it. The entry in his mental ledger grew. The woman was not merely forgetful. She was taking. The thought was a quiet, creeping thing, as unwelcome and persistent as the fine red dust that settled on every surface of his life, no matter how often Cora wiped it away. He began to watch her. His gaze, once dismissive, now became sharp, analytical. He observed the way her hands, raw and chapped, trembled slightly as she served his coffee. He saw the faint, bluish tint to her lips after a fit of coughing. He saw her shivering in the morning chill, her shawl a threadbare defense against a wind that carried no warmth. He saw these things, but he interpreted them through the cold lens of his suspicion. They were not signs of illness or hardship. They were the tells of a liar, the practiced theatrics of a thief. The silence in the house changed. It was no longer a comfortable emptiness, but a space thick with unspoken judgment. Every scrape of her chair, every soft footfall on the stairs, seemed to Sterling an act of stealth. He found himself cataloging his possessions, his eyes sweeping over the mantelpiece, the gun rack, the heavy silver candlesticks his mother had prized. He felt a cold anger settle in his gut. This house, this land was a legacy. It was built on the sweat and blood of his grandfather, a man who had understood the currency of loyalty. This quiet, waifish woman was taking from that legacy, chipping away at its foundations with her petty thefts. He remembered his grandfather's stories, tales of hardship and honor on this very land. He thought of the far edge of his property, a place he hadn't visited in years, where the old family cemetery lay overgrown with mesquite and forgotten promises. His grandfather had believed a man's worth was measured by his word and the strength of his convictions. Sterling believed it was measured by what he could hold onto, what he could protect from the grasping hands of the world. And Cora Whitmore was grasping. Her quiet defiance, her perfect work now seemed like a clever mask for her deceit. The suspicion was no longer a quiet thing. It was a weight pressing down on him, demanding action. He would not act rashly. He would wait. He would let the evidence gather until it was as solid and irrefutable as a branding iron, and then he would act with the clean, swift finality of a butcher. He owed that to the Maddox name. The missing items grew from trifles to treasures. A week after the beans, a small bottle of laudanum vanished from the medicine cabinet. Sterling's jaw tightened. That was not a matter of hunger. It was a weakness, a vice, something to be sold for a pittance in the dusty back alleys of the town. His suspicion, once a quiet unease, began to harden into a cold and brittle certainty. A few days later, a thick wool blanket disappeared from the linen press. It was not just any blanket. It was one his mother had favored, its edges frayed from years of being drawn tight against the winter chill. The theft felt personal, an intrusion not just into his house, but into his memory. This was not need. This was a pattern of betrayal. The small, persistent cough, the frail frame, he now saw them as tools of a cunning trade, a performance designed to elicit a pity she did not deserve. In the harsh arithmetic of the frontier, a person's worth was proven by their actions, and Cora Whitmore's actions tallied up to a single damning word: thief. He would not abide it. The trust of his household was not something to be given freely. It was a wage earned through loyalty, and she had stolen it as surely as she had stolen the blanket. He decided in the cold and silent courtroom of his mind to set a trap. It would not be a confrontation of messy words which could be twisted into excuses and pleas. It would be a simple, clean test of character, an act of justice that felt as righteous and necessary as culling a diseased steer from the herd. That evening he went to the heavy oak chest at the foot of his bed. From a velvet-lined box he retrieved his mother's locket. It was silver-heavy in his palm, its surface worn to a soft gleam by her touch. It held no picture, only the faint, lingering scent of her lavender water and the immense weight of his own grief. It was the last piece of softness in his world, a world he had deliberately stripped of such things. He held it for a long moment, the cool metal a stark contrast to the cold fire of his resolve. Then he walked to the polished mahogany dresser. He placed the locket deliberately on the corner, letting it catch the fading light from the window. It lay there, a gleaming lure in the dimming room, a silent silver question. He imagined her hands, those small, chapped hands, reaching for it in the quiet of the morning. He pictured the glint of greed in her eyes as she pocketed a memory that was not hers to take. The image solidified his purpose, stripping away any lingering doubt. He was not being cruel. He was merely bringing a hidden truth into the light. He would not speak to her of it. He would not warn her. He would let her own nature, her own choices lead her to the verdict. In this land, a person was defined by what they did when they thought no one was watching. He would watch, and he would let her actions write her guilt in a script so plain and undeniable that even she could not refute it. Then, and only then, he would cast her out, and the ledger of his life would once again be balanced. For 2 days the silver locket remained untouched. It sat on the dresser, a silent accusation waiting for a crime. Each morning Sterling would enter his room after breakfast, his eyes going first to that polished corner of wood. He saw the locket there, a small victory that felt strangely like a disappointment. He told himself he was testing her restraint, that she was wrestling with her conscience. But a part of him, a small, unacknowledged part, felt a flicker of hope that he was wrong. On the 3rd morning, the hope was extinguished. He walked into his room, and the gleam of silver was gone. A void of dark, polished wood lay where it had been. He stared at the empty space, a quiet ringing in his ears. There was no anger, no shock, only a grim, hollow satisfaction that settled deep in his bones. His judgment was confirmed. The case was closed. He saw Cora later that morning as she cleared his breakfast dishes. Her face was paler than usual, almost translucent in the harsh morning light. Her movements were even quieter, more deliberate, as if she were trying to shrink away from the very air she breathed. She did not meet his gaze, but he felt her awareness of him a tense, fraught thing. He imagined the locket tucked away in a pocket of her worn dress, its cold weight a secret she thought she kept so well. He said nothing. An open accusation was messy, emotional. It would lead to a torrent of denials, perhaps even tears, and he had no use for either. He preferred the clean, cold finality of observation. The truth in his world did not need to be spoken aloud. It was a tangible thing, something you could see and weigh. The empty space on his dresser was all the truth he required. All day he went about his business, inspecting fences, consulting with his foreman, updating his ledgers. But his mind was elsewhere. He was composing the final entry for Cora Whitmore. He would pay her the week's wages. He was a just man after all. And then he would tell her to be gone by sunrise. There would be no argument. His word was law on this ranch. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the dusty plains in hues of orange and blood, he made a new decision. Dismissing her was not enough. He needed to see. He needed to witness the final act of her betrayal, to see where she would sell a piece of his mother's soul for a few dollars. The need was a cold, hard knot in his gut. It was not about justice anymore. It was about confirmation, about proving to himself that his fortress of cold logic was impenetrable. That evening he saddled his horse, a powerful bay named Judge. He did it himself, the familiar ritual of cinching the saddle and checking the bit, a small comfort. He led the horse to the deep shadow of the cottonwood grove that bordered the main house, and waited. His heart was a cold, heavy stone in his chest. From here he could see the kitchen door she always used. When she finally emerged clutching a small, heavy-looking bundle wrapped in cloth, he did not move. He waited until she was a small, determined figure, moving steadily down the dusty track away from the ranch. Then, keeping to the shadows, he nudged Judge into a slow, silent walk. He would follow her. He would see where she sold her stolen faith. And then he would cast her out, erasing her from his world as easily and permanently as he would a line in his ledger. The wind howled down from the plains, a low and mournful sound, like a wounded beast. Sterling kept a careful distance, letting Judge pick his way through the encroaching darkness. He had expected Cora to head toward the lights of town, toward the saloons and pawn shops, where a stolen locket could be quickly converted to cash. But she didn't. She walked in the opposite direction toward the desolate patch of land where the town's memory faded into mesquite and rock, where the land was too poor for grazing and too forgotten for burying anyone of consequence. She moved slowly, her frail form bent against the wind, clutching the heavy bundle to her chest, as if it were the only anchor in a hostile world. The path she took was faint, little more than a suggestion of passage through the thorny scrub. Sterling's curiosity, a cold and academic thing until now, began to stir with something else, something closer to confusion. There was nothing out here, nothing but dust shadows and the forgotten graves of the past. After a mile, he saw it. A structure huddled against the landscape, so dilapidated it seemed held together only by stubbornness and rot. It was a crumbling shack, its roof sagging, its walls patched with rusted tin and raw planks. It leaned against the evening sky like a tired old man huddled near the crooked fence of the neglected cemetery. The place reeked of a poverty so profound it felt like a sickness on the air. This was not the den of thieves he had imagined. There were no rough men, no sounds of drunken laughter. There was only a profound and unsettling silence. Sterling dismounted, tying Judge's reins to the low-hanging branch of a withered oak tree. He moved forward on foot, his boots making no sound in the soft dust. The certainty that had been his shield all day began to feel thin, brittle. This was a place of desperation, not of cunning. He crept closer, his hand resting on the butt of the Colt at his hip, a gesture born of instinct rather than any real sense of threat. He found a position behind the broad trunk of the oak, which offered a clear view of the shack's single grimy window. The dim, flickering light from a tallow candle cast long, dancing shadows within. He saw Cora's silhouette as she pushed open the groaning door and disappeared inside. He waited, his breath held, expecting the appearance of an accomplice, a partner in her quiet crimes. Instead, he heard it. It was a sound that cut through the wind's mournful howl, thin and unmistakable. A child's cough, a weak, rattling sound that spoke of a deep sickness in a small chest. It was followed by another softer cough, and then a quiet whimper. The sound struck Sterling with the force of a physical blow. It was a detail that did not fit in the neat ledger of his conclusions. Children. Here, in this forgotten corner of the world. He stared at the shack, no longer seeing a criminal's hideout, but a place of profound and desperate secrecy. The cold stone of his certainty began to fracture, and for the first time that day, a sliver of doubt, sharp and unwelcome, pierced the armor of his judgment. Drawn by a force he didn't understand, Sterling moved closer, his boots silent on the packed earth until he was right beside the grimy, cracked window. He peered inside, and the world he had so carefully constructed, the world of cold facts and logical conclusions, began to unravel. He saw Cora enter not as a thief, but as a savior. 6 small children emerged from the shadows of the one-room shack, their movements slow, their faces pale and smudged with dirt. They ranged from a small toddler who could barely stand to a solemn-faced boy of about 10. They were not loud or boisterous. They were quiet, their eyes large and watchful like frightened deer. They gathered around Cora, their small hands reaching for her dress, their faces turned up to hers, with a desperate, absolute trust. Sterling watched frozen as she knelt and unwrapped the bundle she had carried so carefully. The thick wool blanket, the one he thought stolen for profit, was gently wrapped around the shoulders of a shivering little girl with fever-bright eyes. The bottle of laudanum was not for Cora's own vice. He watched as she measured a single precious drop onto a spoon and administered it with a gentle hand to a small boy whose chest rattled with every breath. The tin of peaches was opened, and he saw her divide the contents onto 6 chipped plates, each child receiving a single syrupy slice of fruit, which they ate with a slow, deliberate reverence. The scene was a silent, powerful refutation of everything he had believed. Each stolen item was accounted for not in a pawn shop ticket, but in an act of desperate love. The food from his larder, the medicine from his cabinet, the warmth from his linen press, none of it had been taken for greed. It had been given. Then came the final crushing blow to his certainty. He saw Cora kneel before the oldest girl, a child, with sorrowful, intelligent eyes that seemed to hold the weight of the world. From the pocket of her dress, Cora pulled out the silver locket. Sterling's heart hammered against his ribs. He watched, expecting to see it bartered for some hidden foodstuff or coin. Instead, Cora took the girl's small, chapped hand in her own. She didn't sell the locket. She pressed it firmly into the girl's palm and closed her small fingers around it. She leaned in close, and though he could not hear the words clearly through the glass, he saw her lips move, her expression one of profound tenderness. He saw a flicker of something beautiful and heartbreaking pass between them, a quiet promise in the dim, flickering light. He imagined her words a whisper of comfort against a world of pain. The fortress of his certainty didn't just crack. It crumbled into dust and blew away on the cold Texas wind, leaving him exposed and hollowed out by a shame so vast it felt like a physical blow. He had not been a judge. He had been a fool. Sterling retreated. He backed away from the window, from the shack, from the truth that was too sharp to hold. He moved like a man in a dream, untying Judge's reins and mounting with a mechanical stiffness. He rode back to his grand, empty ranch house, the silence of its halls no longer a comfort, but a loud and ringing accusation. Every polished surface seemed to mock his blindness. Every tick of the grandfather clock in the hall seemed to be counting the beats of his shame. The image of those 6 small faces and of Cora's selfless love was burned into his mind. He was hollowed out, scoured clean by a shame so profound it felt like a physical illness. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, but the liquor brought no warmth, only a bitter taste that matched the one in his soul. He had judged a woman for stealing bread when she was feeding a starving flock. He had condemned her for taking a blanket when she was warding off a killing frost. He had damned her for taking a locket that she had given as an act of grace. Restless, tormented by a new kind of silence, he found himself in his late father's study. The room smelled of old leather and dust, a place he rarely entered. He ran a hand over the spines of the leather-bound books, his fingers tracing the gold leaf of titles he'd never read. His eyes fell upon a stack of his grandfather's old journals tucked away on a bottom shelf. He didn't know what he was looking for. An answer. An absolution. He pulled one out, its cover warped by time and humidity. He opened it, the pages brittle and yellowed. He scanned the neat, spidery script of his grandfather, Elias Maddox, a man he remembered only as a stern portrait on the wall. He read of droughts and cattle drives, of land purchases and disputes. Then his eyes fell on a faded entry, a name he'd heard his father mention in passing, always with a somber shake of his head, the Black Creek ambush. The entry was dated nearly 30 years prior. Elias wrote of being caught in a narrow canyon by a band of Comanche raiders. He wrote of certain death of his 6 ranch hands who had stood with him. Sterling read on his heart a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. Elias had been the sole survivor. The entry spoke of a debt that could never be repaid of 6 good and brave men who had fallen to save one. It was a story he'd always dismissed as family lore, a dramatic tale to aggrandize the Maddox name. Now he wondered. 6 men. 6 children huddled in a shack on the edge of the forgotten cemetery. The number echoed in the hollow space inside him. He turned the page. There at the bottom, his grandfather had listed the names of the fallen, a roll call of honor, written in stark black ink. He read them aloud, his voice a rough whisper in the silent room. Whitmore, Cole, Davies, Dunn, Ferris, Hayes. Whitmore. The name struck him with the force of a physical blow. Cora Whitmore. He slumped into the leather chair, the journal falling open in his lap. The quiet courage he had just witnessed, the fierce defiance in the face of starvation and sickness. It felt older, deeper than one woman's kindness. It felt like a promise that had been carried in silence through poverty and despair by the daughter of a man who had died for a Maddox. The weight of his own misjudgment was crushing, but it was now overshadowed by a different kind of debt, one that had been left unpaid for a generation. Sterling did not sleep. The weight of his grandfather's journal in his hands was heavier than any ledger he had ever held. It was a book of debts, not of profits, and the final entry was a crushing indictment of his own ignorance. Before the first hint of gray light touched the horizon, before the world was awake to witness his shame, he acted. His movements were quiet, deliberate. He went to his own well-stocked larder, the one he had guarded with such cold suspicion. He pulled down a 50-pound sack of flour, its weight a solid, tangible thing in his arms. He added a side of cured bacon, a bag of dried beans, and 2 cans of sweetened milk. He loaded the provisions into a canvas sack, his actions speaking a language of atonement that his voice could not yet form. He carried the heavy sack to his horse, the sky above him a deep, star-flecked purple. He rode not with the grim purpose of a man seeking to confirm a verdict, but with the quiet urgency of one trying to right a profound wrong. He took the familiar path to the edge of town. The shack, a dark, sleeping silhouette against the coming dawn. It was not a grand gesture. He did not approach the door to announce his presence or demand gratitude. Words he now understood were cheap and often false. Action was the only truth. He dismounted, and with a strength born of shame, he hauled the heavy sack onto the shack's dilapidated porch. The wood groaned under the weight, a sound that seemed to echo the groan in his own soul. He set the provisions down gently, a silent offering on a broken altar. He didn't knock. He didn't wait. He simply left the offering and retreated, leading his horse back to the cover of the withered oak tree. He waited hidden as the sun began to spill its first golden light over the plains. He needed to see, not to claim credit, but to witness the small measure of relief his offering might bring. The shack door creaked open, and Cora emerged. She looked even smaller in the morning light, her form frail against the vast, empty landscape. She stopped short, her body going still, as she saw the large canvas sack on her porch. Sterling saw a flash of fear in her eyes, the instinctive reaction of someone who expects nothing from the world but trouble. She looked around, her gaze sweeping the empty horizon, searching for a threat. Finding none, she approached the sack cautiously, as one might approach a sleeping snake. She untied the rope at its top and peered inside. Her shoulders, which had been hunched against the cold and the weight of her world, sagged with a different kind of weight. He saw confusion, then disbelief, then a slow, reluctant, weary gratitude dawn on her face. She looked up at the sky as if questioning the heavens for this unexpected mercy. From his hiding place, Sterling watched her haul the sack inside the effort, making her small frame tremble. He felt no satisfaction, no easing of the knot of shame in his gut. This was not charity. It was the first clumsy payment on a debt of honor. He was speaking a language he was only just beginning to relearn, the currency of the frontier, where a sack of flour carried more weight than a bag of gold, and where a man's worth was measured not by what he owned, but by the promises he kept. He had a generation of promises to keep. Cora was wary. The anonymous gifts continued appearing on her porch in the quiet hours before dawn, like offerings from a ghost. 2 days after the flour, a stack of freshly chopped firewood appeared, neatly piled and dry. Then a pail of fresh, warm milk from his dairy cow, left every other day without fail. She accepted them with a quiet dignity that bordered on suspicion. Each morning her eyes would search the empty horizon, looking for the benefactor, who was both her savior and a source of profound unease. She was a woman accustomed to taking what she needed in secret. To be given things openly felt like a trap she didn't understand. At the Maddox ranch, an awkward and silent dance began. Sterling, stripped of his cold certainty, was left with a heavy, unspoken shame. He could not bring himself to speak the words of apology, for they felt too small, too hollow to contain the magnitude of his misjudgment. Instead, he began to speak in the only language he had left action. He changed his patterns. He started leaving things in plain sight for her, not as traps, but as offerings disguised as opportunities for her to steal. A basket of fresh eggs from the hen house would be left on the kitchen table, far from the larder where they belonged. A small jar of honey would appear on a shelf by the back door. One afternoon, after a trip to the general store, he left a small, neatly wrapped package on the corner of the kitchen counter. Inside were 2 pairs of child-sized woolen socks. Cora never acknowledged these items. The eggs would simply be gone the next morning, the honey pot slightly lighter, the socks vanished without a trace. And Sterling never mentioned them. He never thanked her for the hot coffee that was waiting for him each morning, and she never pointed out that it had been poured before he arrived. Their silence, once a wall of suspicion, was slowly being rebuilt into a fragile bridge of unspoken understanding. It was a confession and an apology made without a single word. He was giving her permission to carry her burden, and in his own clumsy way offering to share its weight. He found himself watching her differently. He saw the fierce defiance in the set of her jaw as she scrubbed a stubborn pot, the stubbornness of a woman who would not be broken by hardship. He saw the deep well of weariness in her eyes, but also a flicker of something else, something resilient and unbreakable. He began to understand that her quietness was not meekness, but a fortress of silence she had built around a sacred trust. One evening he saw her pause by the study door, her hand hovering over the frame. She was looking at the portrait of his grandfather, Elias Maddox, her expression unreadable. In her other hand, she clutched a small, carved wooden bird, something Sterling hadn't seen before. It was crudely made, but with a certain charm. She held it for a long moment, as if drawing strength from the painted gaze of the man on the wall, and the small totem in her hand before turning and continuing her duties. The moment was fleeting, but it planted a seed of a new question in Sterling's mind. The debt was not just his to repay. It was a legacy she was already honoring in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. The first frost came without warning, a silent thief in the night that coated the plains in a fragile silver shell. The air grew teeth sharp and biting. That evening, as dusk settled, Sterling stood by his study window, watching the last of the daylight drain from the sky. He saw Cora preparing to leave for the shack, pulling her thin, threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders. It was a pathetic defense against the coming cold, as useless as a prayer against a blizzard. Her cough seemed worse in the sharp air, a dry hacking sound that echoed in the quiet yard. A cold knot of something he refused to name tightened in his gut. The debt he owed was not just a matter of food and provisions. It was a matter of life, and he could see how precariously she clung to it. He acted without thinking, moving from the study to the hall, where his own heavy sheepskin coat hung on a peg. It was warm, solid a fortress against the cruelest winter wind. He met her at the kitchen door just as she was about to step outside. She flinched, her body going rigid, her eyes wide with a familiar, hunted look. She was expecting the confrontation she had surely dreaded for weeks, the final cold dismissal. His voice, when it came, was lower than usual, stripped of all accusation, all authority. It was just a sound, rough and unsteady. "It's getting cold," he said. He did not look at her. He couldn't. His gaze was fixed on the worn-out hook by the door, on a crack in the wooden frame, on anything but the fragile woman standing before him. He gestured vaguely with his head toward the coat in his hands. "Take my heavier coat." The silence that followed was immense. He could feel her surprise, her confusion. He had not offered comfort or kindness in all the months she had worked for him, only a cold, silent judgment. This sudden, clumsy gesture was a breach in the wall he had so carefully constructed between them. He didn't wait for an answer. He couldn't bear to. He turned and walked away, leaving the offer hanging in the air between them, as tangible and heavy as the coat itself. He retreated to the sanctuary of his study, feeling as exposed and vulnerable, as if he were the one standing half frozen in the yard. From the window he watched. He saw her stand motionless for a long moment, a statue of disbelief. Then slowly she reached out and took the coat from his hands, which he realized he was still holding out. Her fingers brushed against his, a touch as light and fleeting as a moth's wing, but it sent a jolt through him. She slipped the heavy coat on. It swallowed her small frame, the sleeves hanging well past her hands, the hem brushing her ankles. She looked like a child playing dress-up in her father's clothes. She hesitated, looking back at the house at the window where he stood hidden in the shadows. Then she turned and began the long walk toward the shack, his large, warm coat wrapped around her, a shield against the encroaching cold. And for the first time, Sterling Maddox felt something other than shame or duty. It was a strange, unfamiliar ache, a quiet sort of warmth in the cold, empty rooms of his heart. The cold snap was a prelude. 2 days later, a true winter storm blew in from the north, a howling beast of ice and wind that turned the world white and blind. The sky, heavy with ash-colored clouds, looked away. Sterling stood at his window, watching the snow come down in thick, blinding sheets, erasing the familiar lines of his ranch, turning it into a hostile, alien landscape. He expected Cora to leave early to make it to the shack before the worst of the storm hit. But the hours passed, and she remained her movements slow and labored as she finished her chores. Her cough was a constant raw sound now, and he saw the way she braced herself against the furniture after each fit. When dusk fell, and the storm raged with a new fury, she finally donned his heavy coat and stepped out into the blizzard. An hour later, when she had not returned to the main house to sleep in her small room off the kitchen, as was her custom, a knot of cold dread tightened in Sterling's chest. The storm was no place for a healthy man, let alone a woman as frail as she was. He told himself it was the debt, the duty. He told himself it was his responsibility to ensure the keeper of the promise was safe. But beneath the logic, there was a raw, undeniable fear. He saddled Judge in a whirlwind of motion, pulling on his own worn leather coat, which offered little protection compared to the one she wore. He rode into the blizzard, his face bent against the stinging ice, following the path to the shack that was now etched into his soul. The wind howled, trying to rip the reins from his hands, the snow, a suffocating curtain. He found her halfway there, a small, dark shape against the endless, swirling white. She had collapsed in the snow, his massive coat a partial shroud around her. He leapt from the saddle, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knelt beside her, turning her over gently. Her face was ashen, her lips blue with cold, her breathing a shallow, painful whisper. She was unconscious. He lifted her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, a fragile bundle of bones and fierce, stubborn will. He remounted, holding her tight against his chest, her head lolling against his shoulder. He urged Judge forward the horse, fighting for every step in the deepening drifts. When they reached the shack, he didn't hesitate. He slid from the saddle, still holding her, and kicked the flimsy door open. For the first time, he crossed the threshold, entering her world, not as a spy or a ghost, but as a participant. The reality inside was a physical blow. The cold was almost as bitter as it was outside, the only warmth coming from a pitifully small fire smoldering in the hearth. And the children. 6 pairs of wide, terrified eyes stared at him from a huddle of threadbare blankets in the far corner. They weren't crying. They were silent, their fear too deep for tears. He saw the bare walls, the floorboards, with gaps large enough to see the frozen earth beneath the profound, grinding poverty she had hidden from him. He saw the stark reality of her sacrifice. And in the eyes of the children he saw something else, a fierce, protective love for the woman in his arms, a love that mirrored the one he had seen her give them. This was not just a secret she kept. It was a home she had forged from nothing but her own breaking heart. Sterling laid Cora down on the most stable-looking cot, piling the thin, threadbare blankets over her still form. He stoked the pitiful fire, adding the few remaining logs he found by the hearth, until it blazed with a desperate, hungry life, pushing back the deadly chill. The children watched him, a silent, fearful jury, their eyes tracking his every move. He was an intruder in their fragile world, a giant in their small space. He took a cloth and dipped it in a bucket of icy water, wringing it out before gently placing it on Cora's fevered brow. She murmured something in her sleep, a name he couldn't catch, her body trembling beneath the blankets. As he worked, he felt a presence beside him. It was the oldest boy, the one with the solemn, watchful eyes. "Is she gonna die?" The boy asked, his voice small but steady, laced with an adult's weary resignation. Sterling looked at him. Truly looked at him for the first time. "I won't let her." He said the words a vow he hadn't intended to make. The boy seemed to weigh his answer. He stared at Sterling, his gaze unnervingly direct. She says our fathers were heroes, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. She says they died for a Maddox. The words landed like hammer blows, each one connecting the painful present to the forgotten past. This was not just charity. This was not just a woman's kindness. This was a debt passed down through blood and grief. "What's your name, son?" Sterling asked, his own voice rough. "Marcus," the boy replied. "Marcus Cole." Cole. The name from his grandfather's journal. The connection was no longer a suspicion. It was a certainty, sharp and painful. Sterling's gaze swept over the other 5 small, huddled forms. They were not just orphans. They were a living legacy of the men who had saved his family's name. His eyes fell on a small, worn Bible resting on a crate beside Cora's cot. It was the only book in the entire shack. He picked it up, its cover soft and worn from countless readings. As he opened it, a folded piece of parchment, yellowed and brittle with age, fell from within. He carefully unfolded it. On it, in faded brown ink, were 6 names written in a neat, careful hand: Jedediah Whitmore, Thomas Cole, Samuel Davies, Abraham Dunn, Caleb Ferris, Isaiah Hayes. Beside the list was a date, the same date as the Black Creek ambush. His world tilted on its axis. The seeds of truth he had stumbled upon had now taken root, growing into a terrible, undeniable tree of obligation. Cora Whitmore wasn't just an orphan's keeper. She was the daughter of Jedediah Whitmore, one of the men who had fallen. She was carrying out a legacy of honor with nothing but her own quiet courage, and a faith written in a worn-out book, a faith she was now paying for with her own life. He looked from the names on the parchment to the sleeping woman on the cot, and he knew that the debt was his now entirely and absolutely. The storm broke as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean and dangerously cold. Cora's fever, however, did not break. For 2 days, Sterling stayed at the shack, a silent, grim-faced nurse. He fetched water, kept the fire roaring with wood. He chopped himself and forced broth between Cora's cracked lips. The children, after their initial terror, accepted his presence with the quiet resignation of those long accustomed to chaos. They watched him, their eyes missing nothing. On the 3rd morning, a new storm arrived. This one came on horseback. Sterling was outside checking on Judge when he saw them coming, the town's portly sheriff, a man whose loyalty was known to be as flexible as his morals, and beside him the land developer Silas Thorne. Thorne was a man who looked like he'd been carved from greed, with a smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. He was the reason no one had ever laid claim to this worthless patch of land. He wanted it for a rail spur and had been waiting for the right moment to seize it. Sterling moved to stand in front of the shack's door, his body a silent barrier. He knew what was coming. Thorne and the sheriff dismounted, their boots crunching on the thin layer of snow. Thorne held a piece of paper in his gloved hand. An eviction notice. Maddox. The sheriff grunted, his gaze shifting uncomfortably. "Didn't expect to see you out here?" "I'm here," Sterling said, his voice flat and cold. Thorne stepped forward, his smile thin and predatory. "We've come to remove the squatters, Sterling. This land is part of a development grant. These people are trespassing." He gestured dismissively at the shack. From inside, Sterling heard a small whimper. The children were listening. He looked past the sheriff, past Thorne, his gaze as hard and unyielding as the frozen earth beneath his feet. He had spent his life building a fortress of silence and solitude. Now he would use it as a weapon. As Thorne took another step forward, the eviction notice held out like a warrant. The shack door opened. But it was not Cora who was revealed. It was Sterling Maddox stepping out onto the dilapidated porch to his full height. He stood there tall and unmoving, a figure of immense wealth and power in a place of utter poverty. The contrast was stark absolute. This land. Sterling set his voice quiet, but carrying the cold authority of a command that had never been disobeyed. And these children are under my protection. The sheriff shuffled his feet. Thorne's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Now, Sterling. He began trying for a placating tone. This is a legal matter. Sterling's eyes narrowed. Then you will find it is a legal matter with me. He interrupted, his voice dropping lower, each word laced with ice. They belong here. It was a public declaration, a line drawn in the snow-dusted mud. It was a vow to honor a debt his family had long forgotten. He was no longer just a rancher guarding his assets. He was a man taking a stand, and in the cold morning air, the weight of his grandfather's name settled on his shoulders. Not as a burden, but as a mantle of responsibility he was finally ready to wear. Thorne and the sheriff retreated, their threats hanging empty and impotent in the cold air. They were not defeated, merely delayed. Sterling knew this, but for now there was a more immediate battle to be won. He hitched a wagon, and in a slow, solemn procession, he moved Cora and all 6 children from the squalor of the shack to the vast, echoing halls of the Maddox ranch house. The fortress of silence was breached. The vast, empty manor, once a testament to his solitude, was suddenly filled with the chaotic, vibrant sounds of life. The soft scuff of small, hesitant feet on the polished wooden floors. The whispered conversations in the dark hallways. The occasional startling burst of a child's laughter, a sound so foreign in that house, it seemed to make the very walls tremble. The transition was a clumsy one. The children were like wild things brought indoors, terrified of the fine furniture and the sheer, overwhelming space. They huddled together in the large guest room he assigned them, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and fear. They spoke in whispers, as if afraid a loud noise would shatter the fragile illusion of their safety. Sterling, a man who understood the temperament of 1,000 head of cattle better than the heart of one small child, fumbled his way toward fatherhood. He found himself engaged in tasks he had never imagined. He sat for an hour by the bedside of the youngest girl, patiently coaxing her to take a spoonful of broth. He spent an afternoon with a pocket knife and a block of pine, clumsily carving a small wooden bird for the boy, with the rattling cough, its wings uneven, but its intention pure. He even found himself on his hands and knees in the grand parlor, trying to mend a broken doll with a needle, and thread his large, calloused fingers hopelessly inept. He did not know what he was doing. He was a man of ledgers and fences, of clear lines and cold, hard facts. This new world of scraped knees, quiet tears, and unspoken fears was a foreign territory. But he learned. He learned that a shared bowl of stew could be a treaty of peace. He learned that a mended doll could be a promise of safety. He learned that sometimes the most important thing a man could do was simply to sit in silence beside a child's bed and wait for a fever to break. From her own room, where she was slowly recovering in a warm, comfortable bed, Cora watched him. Still frail, her body weak from the sickness that had nearly claimed her, she would see him through her open door, a large, awkward man moving quietly through his own house, as if he were the intruder. She saw him try to coax a smile from the toddler, his own face a mask of stern concentration. She saw him listen with a strange, solemn intensity as Marcus the oldest spoke of the other children's fathers, piecing together a fragmented history of heroism. She watched him with a quiet, growing wonder. The cold, hard rancher who had looked at her with such disdain was being replaced piece by a gentle, protective patriarch. His empty house, once a grave for his own solitude, was slowly, clumsily becoming a home. And in the quiet moments when his guard was down, she saw in his eyes the same profound loneliness she had long carried in her own heart, and she began to understand that they were both just broken people trying to build something whole from the pieces they had left. Silas Thorne was not a man to be denied. In his world, justice wasn't about what was right. It was about who had the most money and the most guns. Sterling's public stand on the porch had been an unexpected obstacle, but Thorne viewed it as nothing more than a temporary inconvenience. A week later, he escalated his tactics, moving from the pretense of law to the blunt instrument of intimidation. The sheriff, firmly in Thorne's pocket, arrived at the Maddox ranch with 2 deputies. He held a piece of paper that was as flimsy as his own integrity, a fraudulent warrant for Cora's arrest on charges of kidnapping. The charge was absurd, but its intent was clear. It was a tool to separate Cora from Sterling's protection, to isolate her and the children, to make them vulnerable. Sterling met them on the veranda of the main house. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for his gun. He simply stood there, his presence as solid and immovable as an old oak. "You're not taking her," he said, his voice low and steady. "This warrant isn't worth the paper it's printed on, and you know it." The sheriff blustered, but his eyes wouldn't meet Sterling's. He was a dog on Thorne's leash, and he knew it. He and his deputies eventually retreated, but the message had been delivered. Thorne would use the law as a weapon, twisting it to serve his greed. The next day, Thorne's own men began to appear. They were hard men with cold eyes, riders who patrolled the borders of the Maddox ranch, their presence a constant silent threat. They didn't cross onto his property, not yet. They just watched their silence more unsettling than 100 shouted threats. They were a visible reminder that Thorne's reach extended beyond the sheriff's office, into the dark corners where violence was a simple transaction. The fight was no longer about a small piece of land or a forgotten debt. It was a battle for the children's freedom and the soul of the community. The town watched, holding its breath. They saw Silas Thorne's blatant power play, and they saw Sterling Maddox, the cold, reclusive rancher, transforming into a fierce protector. Whispers that had once been filled with gossip and suspicion now carried a grudging respect. Sterling felt the shift. He was no longer just a man paying a debt. He was a guardian. The safety of the 6 children and the frail woman who had sacrificed everything for them rested squarely on his shoulders. He looked at Cora, who was growing stronger each day, her quiet resilience a source of strength he was surprised to find himself drawing on. He looked at the children who were slowly beginning to trust him, to see him not as a threat, but as a shield. He realized then that he couldn't win this fight with his money or his influence alone. Thorne was not a man who respected the law. He only respected power. And if Thorne was determined to bring violence to his door, Sterling would have to meet it. He began to prepare. He cleaned his rifles, stocked his ammunition, and walked the perimeter of his ranch, noting every gully, every ridge, every bit of cover. He was a man of peace, but he was also the grandson of Elias Maddox, and he knew that sometimes peace had to be won with a steady hand and a resolved heart. He would not start this fight, but he would be ready to finish it. The attack came under the cover of a moonless night. Thorn, having failed with the thin veneer of law, now resorted to the raw power of violence. A dozen of his hired guns raided the ranch, their objective clear: seize the children, burn the house, and break the man who stood in their way. But Sterling was ready. This was his land, and he knew its secrets as well as he knew the lines in his own ledger. He had prepared. The fight was not a simple shootout in the yard, but a brutal battle of wits and will waged in the shadows of the home he was now determined to protect. As the first shots echoed in the night, chaos erupted. Sterling, holding the main parlor with a repeating rifle, was a study in cold, lethal focus. But he was not alone. Cora, her body still weak, but her spirit a column of fierce defiance, became the heart of their defense. She did not take up a gun. Her fight was for the children. With a calm that seemed impossible, she gathered the terrified children from their beds. "Listen to me," she said, her voice a low, steady anchor in the storm of gunfire. "We are going to play a game, a quiet game." She led them not in a panic, but with a practiced resolve toward a heavy rug in the dining room. Beneath it lay a hidden door to a small cellar, a relic from the days of Comanche raids that Sterling's grandfather had built. It was a detail Sterling himself had nearly forgotten until Cora, in her meticulous cleaning, had discovered and pointed it out to him weeks before. A seed planted in peace, now sprouting in war. One by one, she ushered the children down into the dark, musty safety of the cellar. As she was about to close the heavy door, Marcus, the oldest, turned back. "Cora, no," he whispered, his face pale with fear. "Your father was a brave man, Marcus Cole." She said, her voice cracking but her eyes steady. "You are his son. Be brave now. For them." She closed the door, plunging them into darkness, her own form a lone sentinel in the besieged house. The fight raged. Thorne's men, expecting a simple fight against a lone rancher, were met with a disciplined, furious defense. But they were many, and Sterling was one. A heavy boot splintered the back door, and one of Thorne's thugs burst into the kitchen. He saw Cora standing there, a small, defiant figure. He grinned, raising his pistol. "The boss wants the woman and kids first," he snarled. Before he could take another step, a shadow moved like thunder from the pantry. It was Marcus. He had not gone down into the cellar. He swung a heavy iron skillet with all his might, catching the gunman squarely in the back of the knees. The man roared in pain and surprise, his shot going wide. The sound gave Sterling the opening he needed. He fired once from the parlor doorway, the shot clean and final. The gunman collapsed. Sterling looked at Marcus, who stood trembling, the heavy skillet still in his hands, his eyes wide with a terrifying mixture of fear and pride. In that moment, they were not a rancher and an orphan. They were a family fighting as one, their courage a living, breathing echo of the sacrifice made at Black Creek decades before. Blood leaves, Sterling thought, his heart hammering in his chest. But heart stays. The gunfight at the Maddox ranch was brief, but brutal. When the smoke cleared, 2 of Thorne's men lay dead, and the rest had fled into the darkness, their bravado shattered. Thorne's corrupt enterprise, built on intimidation and fear, began to unravel. The foreman of the Maddox ranch, a man fiercely loyal to the family, rode into town with one of the captured gunmen and a story that could no longer be silenced. The fraudulent warrants, the intimidation tactics, the violent raid, it all came pouring out. Faced with the undeniable testimony and the quiet, unwavering power of the Maddox name, the town's weak-willed sheriff had no choice but to issue a warrant for Silas Thorne's arrest. Thorne, ever the coward, had already vanished his greed, leaving a trail of violence and corruption in its wake. The immediate danger was over. A quiet, exhausted peace settled over the ranch. But Sterling's work, he knew, had just begun. The battle had been won, but the promise was not yet fully kept. A week later, he rode into town. He did not ride alone. Cora, her strength slowly returning, her face still pale, but her eyes clear and steady, sat beside him in the buggy. In the back, scrubbed clean, and wearing new clothes he had bought for them, sat all 6 children. They were no longer a secret huddled in the shadows. They were in the open under the full light of the Texas sun. Sterling did not ride as a reclusive rancher, a man known only for his wealth and his silence. He rode as a father. Their destination was not the general store or the bank, but the dusty, imposing courthouse at the center of town. He walked inside, his boots echoing on the stone floors, Cora at his side, the children trailing behind them like a small, solemn procession. He went to the office of the circuit judge, a weary man with kind eyes, who had seen all the sorrow and hope the frontier had to offer. Sterling spoke, his voice low but clear, without a hint of the awkwardness he felt. He told the story. He spoke of the debt from Black Creek, of the 6 men who had fallen, and of the legacy of honor that had been carried in silence by one brave woman. Then, with Cora by his side, her hand resting lightly on his arm, he formally adopted all 6 children. He signed the papers with a steady hand, his signature a stark black line that bound their future to his. He gave them more than just his protection. He gave them the Maddox name. Marcus Cole became Marcus Maddox. The little girl with the fever-bright eyes was now Sarah Maddox. One by one, they were reborn, not of blood, but of courage and choice. The town which had once whispered about the strange, frail Maid and the cold, reclusive rancher now looked on with a newfound respect. The doors of the general store opened as they passed the merchants, nodding their heads in a silent acknowledgement. The women who had once gossiped now offered quiet, shy smiles. They saw not a scandal, not a man burdened by charity, but an act of profound honor. They saw a family being forged not from convenience, but from a duty that ran deeper than blood. And they saw Sterling Maddox, a man they thought they knew, become the kind of man his grandfather once was. That winter, a real peace, one that felt earned and solid, settled over the Maddox ranch. The house, once a silent monument to one man's grief, was now a loud, chaotic, and vibrant home. The cold was kept at bay, not just by roaring fires in the hearths, but by the warmth of a family forged in adversity. One evening, as the snow fell in thick, silent blankets outside, the family gathered around the great stone hearth in the main parlor. The children were sprawled on a thick bearskin rug, their faces rosy in the firelight, their earlier fear replaced by a comfortable sense of belonging. Cora sat in a rocking chair, a quiet smile on her face, as she mended a tear in a small shirt, her cough now a distant memory. Sterling watched them from the shadows, a feeling of profound, aching rightness settling in his chest. He looked at the heavy oak beam that served as the mantelpiece. It was a piece of the house's soul, bearing the carved names of generations of Maddox men, Elias his grandfather, Thomas his father, a history written in wood. He stood and took his grandfather's old hunting knife from its place on the mantel. The steel was cool in his hand, the bone handle worn smooth. He ran his other hand over the rough, aged surface of the oak beam. Then, slowly and deliberately, he began to carve. He did not carve the names of the children he had adopted. He carved the names of their fathers, the names from the parchment in Korah's Bible, the names from his grandfather's journal. He carved them deep into the grain of the beam, giving them a place of honor they had long been denied. Whitmore, Cole, Davies, Dunn, Ferris, Hayes. He carved them right below his own name, a permanent acknowledgement of the debt, a testament to a promise finally and fully kept. The only sound in the room was the scrape of the knife against the wood and the soft crackle of the fire. The children watched, their eyes wide with a solemn understanding. When he was done, he stepped back, his work complete. The 6 names stood out fresh and pale against the dark, aged wood. He looked at Korah, whose eyes were shining in the firelight, tears tracing silent paths down her cheeks. He said nothing. He simply held out the knife to her, offering it handle first. She hesitated for only a moment. Then she stood, placing the mending aside, and walked to him. She took the knife from his hand, her small fingers closing around the handle. She turned to the beam, to the small space he had left beside his own name. With a steady hand, she began to carve. She carved her own first name, Korah, right beside his. It was a vow made not of words, but of wood and steel and shared history. It was the final quiet click of 2 broken pieces of a legacy, finally fitting together, becoming something new, something whole, something stronger than either had been apart. 1 year later, the Maddox ranch was a place transformed. The sun spilled gold over the Texas plains, illuminating a scene of vibrant, chaotic life. The silence was gone, a distant memory replaced by the sound of children's laughter echoing through the halls and across the sprawling yard. The fortress had become a sanctuary. Korah stood on the porch, her health fully restored, a quiet, steady strength in her eyes. She was no longer a servant hiding in the shadows, but the undisputed mistress of the house, the calm, beating heart of their unconventional family. Around her neck, gleaming in the morning sun, rested a silver locket. It was his mother's, a gift from Sterling, one quiet evening given without words, but with a look that spoke volumes. It was worn now not as a stolen object, but as a badge of honor, a symbol of a trust that had been broken and then rebuilt stronger than before. Sterling came to stand beside her, his arm settling comfortably around her shoulders. It was a gesture that was now as natural as breathing. He was a different man. The cold, hard lines around his eyes had softened, replaced by a quiet watchfulness, the look of a man who has found something precious worth protecting. His ledger book still sat on his desk, but it no longer ruled his world. They watched as the children played near the old cottonwood grove. Marcus, now a confident boy of 11, was teaching the younger ones how to skip stones across the creek. Their shouts and laughter were the new music of the ranch, a melody of hope and second chances. In the quiet heart of Texas, a great house had been built not of stone and timber, but of a debt honored and a promise kept. The ghosts of the past had not been banished. They had been invited in, given a place at the table, their sacrifice finally given meaning in the lives of their children. For Sterling Maddox had learned the frontier's deepest truth. A legacy isn't what you inherit in a will or what's written in a book. It's what you build with your own 2 hands, with courage and with choice. It's the family you forge in the fires of adversity, a family born not from blood, but from a love that is as stubborn, resilient, and life-giving as the Texas soil itself. He looked at Cora, at the children, at the home they had made together, and for the first time in his life, his own ledger felt perfectly, absolutely balanced. If you believe that a home is not just a place you inherit, but something you build from broken pieces, and that the strongest families are forged not from blood, but from a promise kept, then the story of Sterling and Cora was meant for you. Thank you for watching Second Chance Hearts, where we believe every story of quiet courage deserves to be told. Don't forget to subscribe to Second Chance Hearts and hit the notification bell so you never miss a journey of earned redemption and love that is built to last.